4, 1942, 10:20 a.m. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, watching his deck crews frantically rearm bombers. Below him, ordnance is scattered across the flight deck. Fuel lines are open. Bombs are stacked next to torpedoes. In exactly 5 minutes, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers will be burning. The most powerful naval strike force in history will cease to exist. And Nagumo has no idea that American dive bombers are 12,000 feet directly above him, rolling into their attack dives. This is the story of the 5 minutes that changed World War II. To understand what happened at Midway, you need to understand what Admiral Nagumo commanded. The Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet, was the most lethal naval weapon ever created. 6 aircraft carriers, over 400 aircraft, the most experienced naval aviators in the world. For 6 months, this fleet had been unstoppable. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. 8 American battleships sunk or damaged. 2,403 Americans killed. The Kido Butai struck without warning. December 23, 1941, Wake Island. American garrison overwhelmed. The Kido Butai provided air cover for the invasion force. February 19, 1942, Darwin, Australia. 242 people killed. The Kido Butai demonstrated it could strike anywhere in the Pacific. April 5, 1942, Ceylon. British Eastern Fleet forced a retreat to East Africa. The Indian Ocean belonged to Japan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, believed the Kido Butai was invincible. He planned to use it as bait, lure the remaining American carriers into a trap at Midway Island, destroy them, force America to negotiate peace. But what Yamamoto didn't know, what Nagumo didn't know, was that 3 weeks earlier, a team of codebreakers in a basement in Hawaii had cracked enough of the Japanese naval code to reveal the target. Station Hypo, Pearl Harbor. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team worked 20-hour shifts breaking JN-25, the Japanese naval code. They intercepted messages referring to AF as the target. But where was AF? Rochefort suspected Midway. To confirm it, he ordered Midway to send a fake message in plain text. Their water desalination plant had broken down. 2 days later, Japanese radio traffic reported, AF is short of water. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, made the most important decision of his career. He believed the intelligence. He positioned 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown, northeast of Midway. The Japanese expected 0 American carriers. They would face 3. This is the story of how intelligence defeated firepower, how timing defeated tactics, how 5 minutes of chaos destroyed 6 months of Japanese victories. The Battle of Midway was decided between 10:22 a.m. and 10:27 a.m. on June 4, 1942. And Admiral Nagumo watched it happen. Midway Atoll, 2 small islands, 2.4 square miles of coral and sand, 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Strategically worthless except for one thing, its airfield. Control Midway, and you threaten Hawaii. Lose Midway, and Japan's defensive perimeter collapses. Yamamoto needed to capture it. Nimitz needed to defend it. But both admirals knew the real prize wasn't the island. It was the enemy's carriers. Yamamoto's plan was complex. Too complex. 4 separate fleets approaching from different directions. The Kido Butai under Nagumo would strike Midway's airfield first, suppressing its defenses. Then the invasion force would land troops. When American carriers rushed to defend Midway, Japanese submarines would spot them. The Kido Butai would turn and destroy them. Nagumo commanded 4 carriers for this operation. Akagi, his flagship, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Together they carried 248 aircraft. Veteran pilots who had flown at Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Ceylon. The best in the world. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter was superior to anything America had. Faster, more maneuverable, longer range. Japanese pilots had years of combat experience in China. American pilots were mostly rookies, but Nimitz had one advantage Yamamoto didn't know about. His carriers were already in position. Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Yorktown, damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea just 1 month earlier, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Repaired in 48 hours at Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's intelligence said Yorktown was still in dry dock. It wasn't. The American carriers carried 233 aircraft, fewer than the Japanese. But they had one critical advantage. They knew exactly where Nagumo was. He had no idea they were there. June 4, 1942. Dawn. The Japanese fleet approached Midway from June 4, 1942. Dawn. The Japanese fleet approached Midway from the northwest. Nagumo launched his first strike at 4:30 a.m. 108 aircraft, bombers and fighters, headed for Midway's airfield. But Nagumo made a critical decision. He held back half his aircraft, 108 planes, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. These were anti-ship weapons. If American carriers appeared, he wanted to be ready. At 5:34 a.m., Midway's radar detected the incoming Japanese strike. Every aircraft on Midway scrambled. Obsolete F-2A Buffalo fighters, outdated TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, even PBY Catalina flying boats. Everything that could fly went up to meet the Japanese. The result was slaughter. The Zeros tore through Midway's defenders. 17 American aircraft shot down. Only 2 Japanese planes lost. But the Japanese bombers didn't destroy Midway's airfield. The runways were still operational. At 7 a.m., the Japanese strike leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, radioed Nagumo. There is need for a second attack. The airfield wasn't neutralized. Nagumo faced a decision. His reserve aircraft were armed with torpedoes for attacking ships. To strike Midway again, he'd need to rearm them with land attack bombs. That would take 60 to 90 minutes. His aircraft would be vulnerable on the flight deck. Ordnance scattered everywhere, fuel lines open. But Nagumo's scout planes had found nothing. No American carriers. His intelligence said they were still at Pearl Harbor. At 7:15 a.m., he gave the order. Rearm aircraft with land attack bombs for second Midway strike. 15 minutes later, everything changed. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone, launched 30 minutes late due to catapult problems, radioed, "Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway." Nagumo's blood ran cold. Surface ships. But were there carriers? He radioed back. Ascertain ship types and maintain contact. For 20 agonizing minutes, no response. Nagumo's deck crews continued rearming. Torpedoes removed. Bombs being brought up from magazines. Then, at 7:47 a.m., the scout plane reported, "Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier." One carrier, maybe more. Exactly what Yamamoto wanted. But Nagumo's strike aircraft were being rearmed with the wrong weapons. His first strike was still returning from Midway, low on fuel, needing to land immediately. And American aircraft from Midway were attacking his fleet. At 7:45 a.m., the first wave of Midway-based aircraft attacked. 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Slow, obsolete. The Zeros massacred them. 5 shot down. 1 survived. At 8 a.m., 4 B-26 Marauder bombers attacked. All missed. 2 shot down. At 8:20 a.m., 16 Marine SBD Dauntless dive bombers attacked. No hits. 8 shot down. Every attack failed. But they bought time. Time for the American carriers to launch their strikes. Time Nagumo didn't have. At 8:20 a.m., Nagumo's first strike returned from Midway. 108 aircraft circling overhead, low on fuel, some damaged. They needed to land immediately, but his flight deck was covered with aircraft being rearmed. He had to clear it. Nagumo made his second critical decision. He would recover his Midway strike first, then rearm everything with torpedoes, then launch a coordinated strike against the American carrier. It would take time, but it would be devastating. He ordered, "Rearm all aircraft with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Prepare for carrier attack." For the third time that morning, Japanese ordnance crews rearmed their aircraft. Bombs removed, torpedoes reinstalled. The flight deck became a floating ammunition dump. Bombs stacked next to torpedoes. Fuel lines open. Aircraft being refueled. At 8:37 a.m., the last aircraft from the Midway strike landed. Nagumo's 4 carriers turned into the wind to launch. His strike was ready. 108 aircraft armed with torpedoes, the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled. Launch time, 10:30 a.m. But at 10:20 a.m., while his deck crews made final preparations, something happened that Nagumo never saw coming. 3 separate American carrier strike forces were hunting Nagumo. They had launched at different times, from different carriers, with different orders. They should have arrived at different times, but something impossible was about to happen. At 9:20 a.m., Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 toward the Japanese fleet. 15 TBD Devastators. Obsolete aircraft. Slow. Vulnerable. And flying without fighter protection. Waldron had written a letter to his squadron the night before. "If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." At 9:58 a.m., Waldron spotted the Japanese carriers. He immediately attacked. Within minutes, Japanese Zeros swarmed his squadron like hornets. The Devastators flew straight and level, locked into their torpedo runs. Sitting ducks. The Zeros tore them apart. One by one, the American aircraft exploded, burned, and crashed into the Pacific. In less than 10 minutes, all 15 aircraft were shot down. 29 men died. Only 1 survived. Ensign George Gay floated in the water, hiding under a seat cushion, watching the battle unfold around him. Not a single torpedo hit its target. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been annihilated. But their sacrifice was about to matter in ways no one could have predicted. 60 miles away, Wade McClusky had a problem. He'd led 32 dive bombers to the coordinates where the Japanese fleet should have been. But when he arrived at 9:55 a.m., there was nothing. Empty ocean. His fuel was running low. Standard procedure said turn back, return to Enterprise. But McClusky made a decision that would change history. He kept searching. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. His fuel gauge dropped lower. His pilots radioed asking permission to turn back. McClusky refused. Then at 10:05 a.m., he spotted something. A single Japanese destroyer racing northeast at full speed, leaving a white wake across the blue ocean. At 10:20 a.m., Wade McClusky's dive bombers from Enterprise arrived over the Japanese fleet. At the exact same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown arrived from a completely different direction. 2 separate squadrons, launched from different carriers, 47 miles apart, following different flight paths, with no communication between them, arriving at the exact same moment. And below them, the 4 Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable. Flight decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines snaking across the decks, bombs and torpedoes stacked in the open, being swapped out for the 3rd time that morning. Admiral Nagumo had been changing his attack plans all morning. First bombs for Midway, then torpedoes for American ships, then back to bombs. His crews were exhausted. His carriers were floating ammunition dumps. And there was one more factor. The Japanese fighter cover, the deadly Zeros that had just massacred Torpedo Squadron 8, were all at low altitude. They'd been chasing American torpedo bombers for the past 30 minutes. McClusky and Leslie's dive bombers were at 14,000 feet. The Zeros were at sea level. There was no time to climb, no time to intercept. Wade McClusky looked down and saw all 4 Japanese carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. Completely exposed. He gave the order, push over. The human cost of those 5 minutes was staggering. On Akagi, 267 men died. On Kaga, 811. On Soryu, 711. On Hiryu, 416. Over 2,200 Japanese sailors and airmen killed on the 4 carriers alone. But the real loss wasn't the ships. Japan could build new carriers. The real loss was the pilots, the mechanics, the flight deck crews, the men who had trained for years, who had combat experience from China, Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Ceylon. They couldn't be replaced. Japan lost 110 of its most experienced pilots at Midway. Pilots who had flown hundreds of combat missions. The replacements had minimal training. By 1944, Japanese pilots had less than 100 hours of flight time before combat. American pilots had over 300. Admiral Yamamoto received the news of the defeat on his flagship Yamato, 300 miles away. He had been waiting to spring his trap on the American carriers. Instead, his trap had destroyed his own fleet. He immediately ordered a retreat. The Midway invasion was canceled. The Japanese fleet turned west and fled. Yamamoto knew what this meant. Japan had lost the initiative. From now on, they would be defending, not attacking. The Japanese government kept the defeat secret. Wounded survivors were quarantined. Families of the dead were told their sons died in training accidents. The public didn't learn about Midway until after the war ended, but the Imperial Navy knew. They had lost 4 carriers. They had 2 left, Shokaku and Zuikaku. America was building Essex-class carriers, lots of them. By 1943, America would have more carriers than Japan. By 1944, the ratio would be overwhelming. On the American side, the victory was celebrated, but not fully understood. The public knew America had won a great battle. They didn't know how close it had been to disaster. They didn't know that if McClusky hadn't followed that destroyer's wake, if the dive bombers had arrived 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, the outcome could have been completely different. Admiral Nimitz understood. He wrote in his after-action report, Midway was essentially a victory of intelligence. The codebreakers at Station Hypo had won the battle before the first shot was fired. Commander Joseph Rochefort, who had broken the Japanese code and identified Midway as the target, received no immediate recognition. Navy bureaucracy in Washington was jealous of his success. He was transferred to a minor post. He wouldn't receive the Distinguished Service Medal until 1985. Posthumously, the pilots who dove on the Japanese carriers became instant heroes. Wade McClusky received the Navy Cross. Richard Best received the Navy Cross. Maxwell Leslie received the Navy Cross. But 40 torpedo bomber pilots who attacked first and died received their medals posthumously. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent 30 hours floating in the ocean before being rescued. He had watched the entire battle from the water. He saw all 4 Japanese carriers burn. He saw Yorktown get hit. He became a celebrity, touring America selling war bonds. The Battle of Midway changed the Pacific War's trajectory. Before Midway, Japan was advancing. After Midway, Japan was retreating. The strategic initiative passed to America and never returned. 2 months after Midway, America invaded Guadalcanal, the first step in the island-hopping campaign that would end in Tokyo Bay. Japan fought desperately for every island, but they were always defending, always reacting, never attacking. Admiral Nagumo survived Midway. He was given command of a land-based air fleet. In 1944, during the Battle of Saipan, he committed suicide rather than be captured. He never recovered from watching his carriers burn. Admiral Yamamoto was killed in April 1943. American codebreakers intercepted his travel plans. P-38 Lightning fighters ambushed his transport plane over Bougainville. The architect of Pearl Harbor and Midway died in the jungle. America's revenge for December 7th. The 4 Japanese carriers were never replaced. Japan built new carriers, but they never assembled a force like the Kido Butai again. The pilots were gone. The experience was gone. The mystique of invincibility was gone. By 1945, Japan's remaining carriers were used as decoys. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, they sailed without aircraft, trying to lure American carriers away from the invasion fleet. It didn't work. American submarines and aircraft sank them anyway. Today, the Battle of Midway is taught at every military academy in the world. Not as history, as a case study in how battles are won and lost. Lesson 1. Intelligence wins wars. The codebreakers at Station Haipo gave Nimitz the ultimate advantage. He knew where the enemy would be and when they would arrive. Yamamoto had more ships, more aircraft, more experience. But Nimitz knew Yamamoto's plan. That was worth 10 carriers. Today's U.S. military spends billions on intelligence, satellites, signals intelligence, cyber warfare. All descendants of what Rochefort's team did in that basement in Hawaii. The lesson of Midway is clear. Know your enemy better than he knows himself. Lesson 2. Timing is everything. If McClusky's dive bombers had arrived 5 minutes earlier, the Japanese fighters would still have been at altitude. The Americans would have been slaughtered. 5 minutes later, the Japanese carriers would have launched their strike. The American carriers would have been caught with their decks full of aircraft being refueled. Lesson 2. Timing is everything. If McClusky's dive bombers had arrived 5 minutes earlier, the Japanese fighters would still have been at altitude. The Americans would have been slaughtered. 5 minutes later, the Japanese carriers would have launched their strike. The American carriers would have been caught with their decks full of aircraft being refueled. 5 minutes. That's how close America came to losing the Pacific War. Not strategy, not tactics, not courage. Timing. Pure chance. The destroyer's wake. McClusky's fuel gauge. The Japanese carriers turning into the wind at exactly the wrong moment. Military planners hate this lesson. They want to believe wars are won by superior strategy and training. But Midway teaches that sometimes battles are decided by luck, by being in the right place at the right time, by the enemy making one critical mistake. Lesson 3. Decisive moments are measured in minutes. The Battle of Midway lasted 3 days, but it was decided in 5 minutes. From 10:22 a.m. to 10:27 a.m. on June 4, 1942, everything before was preparation. Everything after was consequence. In modern warfare, decisive moments are even shorter. Missiles travel at Mach 5. Cyber attacks happen in milliseconds. Nuclear weapons can end civilizations in 30 minutes. The lesson of Midway is more relevant today than ever. When the critical moment comes, there's no time for hesitation. Lesson 4. Never underestimate your enemy. Yamamoto underestimated American codebreakers. Nagumo underestimated American determination. Japanese intelligence said Yorktown was in dry dock. It wasn't. They said American pilots were inexperienced. Some were, but they were brave enough to press home attacks against impossible odds. The 41 torpedo bomber pilots who attacked first knew they were flying to their deaths. Obsolete aircraft, no fighter escort, against the best pilots in the world. They attacked anyway. They died. But they pulled the Japanese fighters down to sea level. They created the opening for the dive bombers. Lesson 5. Logistics wins wars. Japan couldn't replace what it lost at Midway. America could. By 1943, American shipyards were launching one Essex-class carrier every month. Japan built 2 carriers in the entire war after Midway. By 1944, America had 28 fleet carriers. Japan had 4. The lesson? You can win every battle and still lose the war if you can't replace your losses. Japan's economy couldn't sustain a long war against America's industrial base. Yamamoto knew this. That's why he wanted to force a quick peace after Pearl Harbor. Midway ended that hope. Lesson 6. Flexibility defeats rigidity. Yamamoto's plan was too complex, too many moving parts, too dependent on everything going perfectly. When American carriers appeared unexpectedly, the plan collapsed. Nagumo couldn't adapt fast enough. Nimitz's plan was simple. Find the enemy carriers and sink them. When things went wrong, and they did, American commanders adapted. Spruance launched early. McClusky searched beyond his assigned sector. Best dove despite his oxygen failure. Flexibility won. Today's military doctrine emphasizes adaptability. Plans are guidelines, not scripts. Commanders must think independently. Midway proved that rigid adherence to plans gets you killed. Lesson 7. Morale matters. After Midway, Japanese morale never recovered. Pilots knew they were flying obsolete aircraft against superior numbers. Sailors knew their carriers were vulnerable. The myth of invincibility was shattered. American morale soared. If they could beat the WWII, the fleet that struck Pearl Harbor, they could beat anyone. Every subsequent battle was fought with the confidence that came from Midway. The psychological impact of Midway was as important as the material losses. Japan spent the rest of the war trying to recover what it lost in those 5 minutes. It never did. Today, Midway Atoll is a wildlife refuge. The runways are cracked and overgrown. The gun emplacements are rusted. The only sounds are waves and seabirds. It's hard to imagine that this quiet place was once the center of the world's attention. 5 miles below the surface, Yorktown rests on the ocean floor. Discovered in 1998 by Robert Ballard, the same man who found Titanic. The carrier that shouldn't have been at Midway. The ship that was supposed to be in dry dock. The vessel that helped win the most important naval battle in history. 18,000 feet down, Kaga lies broken. The bomb that hit her came from Richard Best's Dauntless. 1 bomb, 1 pilot, 1 moment. Changed everything. 307 Americans died at Midway. 3,057 Japanese died. Every one of them was someone's son, brother, husband, father. War is not glorious. It's tragic. But sometimes it's necessary. And sometimes, in 5 minutes, everything changes. The last survivors of Midway are in their 90s now. Soon there will be no one left who remembers what it felt like to watch those carriers burn. No one who can describe the sound of dive bombers screaming down. No one who lived through those 5 minutes that changed the world. But the lessons remain. Intelligence matters. Timing matters. Courage matters. Flexibility matters. And sometimes, when everything seems lost, when the odds are impossible, when defeat seems certain, one person, one decision, one moment can change everything. Wade McClusky's fuel gauge showed empty. He should have turned back. He didn't. He followed a destroyer's wake. 5 minutes later, he spotted 4 Japanese carriers. 5 minutes after that, 3 of them were burning. That's the story of Midway. Not a story of inevitable American victory. Not a story of Japanese incompetence. A story of how 5 minutes, 300 seconds, decided the fate of the Pacific War. How intelligence, courage, timing, and yes, luck, combined to create one of the most decisive moments in human history. The next time someone tells you one person can't make a difference, remember Wade McClusky. Remember Richard Best. Remember the 41 torpedo bomber pilots who died so the dive bombers could succeed. Remember Joseph Rochefort and his code breakers working in a basement. This is the story they need to remember. This is history that matters. Because the lessons of Midway, about intelligence, timing, courage, and the power of decisive moments, are as relevant today as they were 83 years ago. If this story moved you, if you learned something, if you understand why these 5 minutes matter, share it. Subscribe for more untold stories from history's most critical moments. Because these stories deserve to be remembered. These lessons deserve to be learned. And these heroes deserve to be honored.